It's a cold winter evening in downtown Los Angeles, and the lights of the city flicker like distant stars in the dark. The streets are alive with the hum of traffic, the clinking of coins, and the muffled conversations of people rushing past. But underneath it all, there's something you can't quite shake. A feeling that something is about to happen, something big. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live as one of the invisible people? To wake up every day with nothing to your name, with nothing but the cold pavement and the unforgiving sky above? To experience the world from the very bottom of the social ladder, where every step is a struggle for survival. What if someone you thought had everything, the kind of person who could change the world with a single tweet, decided to go undercover as one of those invisible souls? That's exactly what Elon Musk, billionaire inventor and tech mogul, was about to do. On a quiet afternoon in his Silicon Valley office, surrounded by piles of paperwork and the constant hum of his companies, a thought struck him. A thought so simple, yet so profound, that it could shake the very foundation of his existence. What would happen if he stepped away from his empire, his fame, his fortune, his power, and saw the world from a different perspective? What if he truly understood the struggles of those who lived on the streets? The answer, he realized, could hold the key to something much larger than he had ever imagined. And so, on a day that seemed like any other, Elon Musk made the decision to go undercover. As a homeless man in Los Angeles, no bodyguards, no private jets, no fancy clothes, just him, his wits, and a change of clothes. The city that had always seemed so distant, so separate from his world, would soon become his new reality. As he walked out of his office, no one knew that the world's most famous entrepreneur was about to embark on an eye-opening journey that would not only change his life, but also reveal something shocking about the world we live in. The decision to go undercover hadn't come without its doubts. Elon had spent days mulling over the idea in his mind, teetering between curiosity and the fear of what he might uncover. But the moment he walked out of his office, there was no turning back. The world he had built, the empire of innovation and technology, felt suddenly distant and surreal. He had the resources to change the world. But could he truly understand the challenges others faced when he had never known true struggle? It was late afternoon when he boarded the plane to Los Angeles. The flight was uneventful, but in his mind, a storm was brewing. His usual self-assurance was now replaced with anxiety. The billionaire, known for his confidence in business decisions, felt small in a way he hadn't anticipated. He was about to enter a world where money meant nothing and reputation held no weight. As the plane touched down, Elon's stomach twisted with anticipation. This wasn't a business meeting or an investment pitch. This was an experiment in empathy, an attempt to strip away everything he knew and expose himself to the raw, uncomfortable truth of homelessness. And yet, in his gut, he couldn't shake the fear that the truth might be too much to bear. It didn't take long for him to realize how ill-prepared he truly was. With a single duffel bag packed with a few basic supplies, he stood on the curb outside the airport, surveying the sprawling city ahead of him. Los Angeles, with its stunning skyline and sun-soaked streets, seemed like the picture of success. But beneath the glimmer, a darker reality awaited. As he passed through the crowded streets of downtown, his eyes began to take in the full scale of the problem. A homeless woman, wrapped in a tattered blanket, sat slumped on the sidewalk, her head buried in her hands. A man with hollow eyes, huddled in a doorway, desperately clutching a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps." The disparity between his world and theirs was shocking. He had seen the statistics, of course, heard the stories, but standing there, feeling the weight of their gazes on him, seeing their lives unfold before his eyes, was an entirely different experience. The tipping point came when he attempted to find a place to sleep for the night. After walking for hours, he found an alleyway where he could rest. A group of people huddled in the shadows near a trash bin, their faces masked in exhaustion, their clothes frayed and dirty. As he approached, a woman, her face obscured by a hood, looked up at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. She was the first person to speak to him since his arrival. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice rough but laced with an unexpected sense of power. Elon swallowed. I need a place to sleep," he stammered. the vulnerability in his voice making him feel more exposed than ever before. Her eyes lingered on him for a long moment, sizing him up. "You're not from around here, are you?" she said with a sharp edge to her tone. "You don't look like you belong." He didn't know how to respond. She was right. He didn't belong. He was just another person in the crowd. But he couldn't erase the nagging feeling that he wasn't one of them. At least not yet. This woman, hardened by the streets, could see through the facade of wealth and status. In her eyes, he was just another lost soul, desperate for survival. For the first time, Elon felt the sting of his own humanity, a truth he hadn't prepared for. The city's vibrant pulse had faded into the background, and all that remained was the struggle for dignity in a world that offered none. The emotional weight hit him harder than he could have imagined. The people on the streets weren't invisible because of their circumstances alone. They were invisible because society had collectively decided they didn't matter. And in that moment, standing in the dim light of a cold alley, Elon Musk's grand experiment had only just begun. The first few days in Los Angeles were a whirlwind of discomfort and eye-opening realizations. Elon had expected challenges, but nothing could have prepared him for the relentless barrage of obstacles that greeted him at every corner. The streets, once a mere concept in his mind, were now a living, breathing nightmare of desperation. Each step forward felt heavier than the last. At first, he tried to blend in, to slip under the radar of the city's bustling masses. He ditched his expensive clothes, replaced them with a worn hoodie and torn jeans, and shaved off his usually meticulously groomed facial hair. His once pristine appearance, one that often turned heads in the corporate world, now marked him as another, faceless figure, just one of many trying to survive. He learned quickly that looking too polished was just as much of a giveaway as looking too disheveled. The mornings were the hardest. Each day, Elon found himself waking up on cold concrete, feeling the sharp bite of the morning air on his skin. The small, dark alleyway that had been his home for the last 2 nights offered little protection. His stomach growled constantly, but the reality of finding food was far more complex than he ever imagined. No longer able to simply reach for his phone and order an Uber Eats meal or stop by a local cafe, he found himself searching for scraps, sometimes offered by kind strangers, other times not. One morning, after walking for hours with no luck, he approached a food bank, hoping for a handout. The line stretched far down the block, the air thick with a sense of collective defeat. As he waited, a man with a heavy, grizzled voice beside him turned to Elon. His eyes were hollow but sharp, like a survivor who had seen too much. "You're new," the man said flatly, his words dripping with suspicion. Elon tried to smile, but the fatigue on his face made it hard to muster anything resembling normalcy. "Just passing through. I'm not from around here." The man laughed bitterly. "You're not the first person to say that. You think you're going to get food, don't you? Just like that? Like you can show up and be fed because you're hungry?" Elon had no answer. The man was right. Nothing about this situation was easy. There was no entitlement here, no guarantees. Every moment was a test of survival. But the real setback came when Elon found himself caught in a dangerous confrontation with a group of aggressive street dwellers. It started with a simple argument over a space on the sidewalk, a place where he'd set down his bag and sat, trying to rest for a few minutes. The group, already irritated by the presence of so many others in their territory, didn't take kindly to a stranger's intrusion. "Move along, man," one of them growled, the menace in his tone undeniable. "This is our spot." Elon, exhausted and fragile, tried to remain calm, but the hostility in the air was thick. Words were exchanged, sharp, biting words, and before he knew it, the situation escalated. A fist came out of nowhere, striking him across the face. His mind raced. This was not how he'd imagined his experiment going. His body ached from the cold, and now his cheek throbbed with pain. He stumbled backward, feeling both humiliated and enraged. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't him. He was Elon Musk, the innovator, the visionary, the man who could always think his way out of anything. But in that moment, none of his intellect, none of his wealth, none of his success mattered. He was just another man, broken and vulnerable in a world that had no sympathy for either. For the first time since embarking on this journey, Elon's confidence faltered. He had faced setbacks before, failed ventures, critics, skeptics. But this was different. The emotional toll of living on the streets was like nothing he had ever known. Each day seemed to push him further into a dark corner, where his doubt loomed large. Who was he kidding? What had he hoped to gain from this? Was it even possible to change anything from this perspective? Or was he just another privileged man trying to play at being one of the masses? As the pain from the blow settled into a dull ache, Elon sat down against a nearby wall, staring at the chaos around him. His thoughts spiraled. What was the point of all this? Had he underestimated the brutality of homelessness? Or was this something deeper, a reckoning with his own humanity? The people around him, so many of them lost, so many resigned to a life of suffering, seemed to carry a truth he could never fully grasp from the comfort of his life. This was no longer an experiment. This was his reality, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. It was the evening of the fourth day, and Elon found himself standing on a street corner, looking out over the horizon. The city's neon lights flickered like fading stars in the distance, casting long shadows over the sidewalks where people walked by, heads down, lost in their own worlds. He had walked miles since morning, but the weariness in his legs was nothing compared to the weight pressing on his chest. Every day felt like a battle for survival. And yet, with each passing hour, something inside him was changing. Something he couldn't yet explain. The pain from the blow to his face had faded, but the emotional ache had only deepened. Every conversation, every encounter, only seemed to confirm one thing. This was the real world. The world where compassion was scarce, and every person was an island unto themselves. His encounter with the aggressive group of street dwellers had shaken him to the core. It was one thing to read about poverty, to hear about it from afar, but to feel it, to live it, was a different kind of brutal. Yet just as he was beginning to feel his spirit buckle under the weight of it all, a strange turn of events forced him to confront his own assumptions head-on. It was a woman, a middle-aged figure with wild, unkempt hair and a weathered face, who would change everything. Elon had first noticed her 2 days ago, sitting alone on a bench near a soup kitchen. She wasn't begging or demanding attention, but her eyes were sharp and calculating, as if she were constantly measuring the world around her. That evening, he found himself wandering toward her bench, hoping to rest for a moment. As he sat down, she didn't acknowledge him at first, but her gaze was piercing, as though she had already studied him in ways he didn't understand. "You're not really one of them, are you?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Elon looked at her, confused. "One of who?" "The ones who live here," she said, her tone flat but knowing. "The ones who are stuck." He swallowed hard. I'm just trying to understand." Her lips curled into a wry smile. "Understand what? The misery? The way it wears you down until you don't know who you are anymore? You can't understand it unless you live it. And even then, you might never get it." Something in her words struck him deeply. The frustration in her voice wasn't anger, it was resignation. She had seen too many come and go, trying to fix what couldn't be fixed with money, influence, or even empathy. Elon felt the sting of her words as if they were aimed directly at him, because, in a sense, they were. Wasn't that exactly what he had been trying to do? To use his power, his resources, to solve a problem he couldn't begin to understand? Was he fooling himself? But then, as the woman turned to leave, something unexpected happened. She stopped, her back still turned to him. "I know what you're doing," she said softly. Elon froze. How could she possibly know? She didn't turn around, but her words were final. "You think you can change everything. That if you can, just see it. If you can just understand, then you'll fix it all. But you can't. Not like that. You're not one of us, and no matter what you do, you'll never be." The words cut through him like a blade. A bitter truth he hadn't anticipated. The harsh reality of it hit him like a flood. She was right. No matter how many times he tried to understand, no matter how deep he delved into the heart of homelessness, he would never fully be one of them. His wealth, his background, his experiences, they would always set him apart. In that moment, the truth dawned on him. He wasn't here to fix homelessness. He wasn't here to impose solutions on people who didn't ask for his help. He was here to learn, to see, not with the eyes of a philanthropist or a businessman, but with the eyes of a human being who had lived in a bubble of privilege for far too long. And as he stood there feeling the weight of her words settle over him, he realized something deeper still. Maybe, just maybe, the answers weren't about fixing the problem. Maybe it was about changing himself, about breaking down the very walls he had built around his own perceptions. It was the beginning of a new understanding. He didn't know exactly where it would lead him, but he knew one thing for certain. He had just crossed a threshold, and the world he had once thought he understood was suddenly far more complex, far more fragile than he had ever imagined. The night had fallen heavy, and the streets of Los Angeles felt colder than ever. Elon's body had grown accustomed to the ache of hunger, the sting of exhaustion, but it was his mind that was beginning to unravel. The woman's words echoed in his thoughts. "You're not one of us." How could he be? He was an outsider, a man who had never truly known what it was like to live without the luxuries that shaped his life. Yet, in a way, those words spurred him into action. The realization hit him that the true challenge wasn't about changing the system. It was about confronting his own limitations and biases. And so, he walked. He had been in Los Angeles long enough to begin understanding the lay of the land, the subtle ways the city and its people operated. But now, it wasn't about observing from the outside. It was about being present, about diving into the raw, unfiltered reality of those who lived on the streets. There was something else he hadn't yet fully grasped, the humanity of it all. The faces he had walked by were no longer just shadows. They were stories, experiences, and lives. It was then that he saw him. An older man, maybe in his 60s, stumbling through the crowd. His clothes were filthy, his face a mask of weariness. And yet, there was something about him that made Elon pause. The man was clearly struggling, but there was a fire in his eyes, a quiet resolve that spoke of survival. Before Elon could react, a group of young men, clearly intoxicated, began to taunt the older man. They shoved him, laughing, as if the very act of bullying gave them power. Something inside Elon snapped. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stop! Leave him alone!" The young men paused, momentarily confused. But then one of them smirked, turning toward Elon. "What's it to you, rich boy?" In that instant, Elon's privilege no longer mattered. There was no wealth, no fame, no empire. Just a man standing between a vulnerable soul and cruelty. The confrontation escalated quickly. Words turned to shoves, and before he knew it, Elon found himself in the middle of a struggle. But something inside him burned brighter than the fear or the adrenaline. He wasn't just standing up for this man, he was standing up for something deeper, his own transformation. The moment shattered him in a way he hadn't expected. As the group scattered and the older man gave Elon a wary nod, he realized the profound truth. In this world, survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about standing up for others, even when you didn't know how things would turn out. He had crossed the line from observer to participant, and in that act, he found a new form of purpose. The dust had settled. The chaos of the confrontation faded into the quiet hum of the city. Elon stood there for a moment, heart still racing, chest heaving. But something was different now. The world felt sharper, more vivid. The smog of his own assumptions had lifted, and he could breathe, really breathe, in a way he hadn't before. The older man, still shaken but clearly grateful, nodded at Elon as if recognizing a shift in him, a shift that hadn't been there before. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice rough. But it was more than just a thanks. It was a recognition of the fact that Elon had chosen to see him, to act when so many would have walked away. For a brief moment, Elon felt as though everything had come full circle. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't about a billionaire pretending to be a homeless man. This was about acknowledging the value of human connection, about finding the courage to stand up and be counted, even when the odds seemed impossible. The days that followed were different. Elon began reaching out to organizations and people who were on the front lines of homelessness, not as an outsider with all the answers, but as someone willing to listen, to learn, and to act in ways that could make a real difference. His empire, SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, remained, but the lens through which he saw the world had shifted. The realization that he couldn't fix homelessness, but could help it, was a humbling and necessary truth. He returned to his life in Silicon Valley, but it was no longer the same. He walked through his high-tech campuses with a new understanding, aware, now, more than ever, of the complex web of human suffering and resilience that existed just outside his gated walls. And when he spoke, it wasn't with the arrogance of a man who had all the answers. It was with the quiet humility of someone who had seen a different side of the world and felt the weight of it. As he sat back in his office one evening, staring out over the lights of his empire, Elon mused on the journey he'd taken. He wasn't the same man who had boarded that plane to Los Angeles. He had learned something deeper than innovation or technology. He had learned that sometimes the greatest discoveries are the ones that change you from the inside out. And in that moment, he realized something powerful. To truly change the world, you first have to understand it. With that thought, Elon turned, his gaze to the city beyond his office window, a city that, in his own way, he had finally begun to understand.